you find yourself drifting back to a time when gods still walked the dusty trails of ancient Greece, fun, uninvited, and usually in disguise. The world then was smaller, more fragrant with resin and olives, more melodic with the strum of the lyre and the endless hum of crickets in the midday sun. Among the gods, one figure stood out, not for thunder or war or wisdom, but for laughter, wine, and the kind of chaos that ends in song. Dionysus. He brought wine, which meant he brought joy and release and a healthy dose of forgetfulness. And with wine came performance, ritual, movement, and spectacle. But he wasn't content with impromptu hillside raves and ceremonial dances in oak groves. Dionysus, for all his madness, was a god of structure, too. He wanted stages, he wanted repetition, he wanted applause. In ancient Greece, goats were tied to Dionysus in all sorts of ways: sacrifices, songs, they'd drink, they'd sing, and sometimes they'd dress up as satyrs, goat-legged, wine-loving followers of Dionysus. These weren't glamorous affairs. Picture mud, reeds, hand-carved masks, and a lot of shouting. And somewhere in that crude merriment, something started to emerge: a structure, a beginning, a middle, and an end. Dialogue, a character, a story. In myth, he was always present in spirit, if not in literal appearance. And Dionysus, watching from the edge of a vine-covered hill, thinking about how best to impress it. The goat didn't respond much, of course, but perhaps it blinked slowly, perhaps it chewed a leaf, and perhaps in that supremely dull reaction, Dionysus found the true audience of theater, not the excitable crowd, but the stillness that follows when even a goat decides to listen. The front row seats of the theater, made of stone and prestige, were called the proedria, and one seat among them was always left empty. It was for Dionysus. And most notably, the term tragoidia, which means goat song. He supposedly stepped away from the chorus and began speaking lines alone, as if he were the character himself. Yes, this was it, the sacred chaos of life, distilled into rehearsal and repetition. But it wasn't just about story, it was about ritual. Tragedy and comedy weren't separate genres yet. They were merely shades of the same ancient impulse to make meaning of mystery, to cry a little and then laugh at your own crying. Imagine that moment, a rustic Dionysian festival, likely half-drenched in wine and goatish aromas, when someone decides to be a god or a king or a fool, not in jest, but in narrative. The crowd may have been confused, or they may have fallen silent for the first time. This strange term would later evolve into the modern word tragedy. Why goat song? Possibly because the prize for early dramatic contests was a live goat. You can almost hear the bustle of preparation, masks being painted with natural dyes, robes dyed with crushed beetle shells, wooden sandals being adjusted for height and posture. 3 playwrights would be selected to present a trilogy of tragedies, followed by a satyr, playa, kind of comedic exhale, all in honor of Dionysus. Possibly because goats were sacred to Dionysus, or because they made funny sounds. No one's entirely sure, and that's exactly the kind of historical ambiguity that suits our sleepy purposes. Unlike the more disciplined deities atop Mount Olympus, Dionysus was a bit of a wanderer. He was born of a mortal mother, and Zeus of Corcyn thus had always been a little on the outside of the divine circle. His early years were a bit of a mess, involving a jealous Hera, a lightning bolt, a womb transfer to Zeus's thigh, and an infancy hidden in a cave somewhere near Mount Nysa, and scratching his chin with the stem of a fennel stalk, thinking, what if we made the chaos ... repeatable? He wanted to turn revelry into something that could be performed again and again, on purpose, with rhythm and maybe even tickets. So he did what gods do best. He invented something humans didn't yet know they needed. None of it made sense, but that was fitting, because Dionysus himself never quite conformed. He wandered through Phrygia and Lydia, through Thrace, and even into far-off India, gathering followers who called themselves Maenads, wild women, who danced under the moonlight and tore things apart in ecstatic frenzy. You might imagine Dionysus reclining under a fig tree, drinking diluted wine. But why goats? The answer isn't as dramatic as one might think. In the rural regions of Atikabu, for Athens had its marble theaters, and chorus lines villagers would gather in clearings. Thespis of Icaria is often named as the first actor in Western history. So Dionysus, in his own mythic timeline, looked down or possibly up from his vineyard realm and nodded. The earliest plays were performed as part of the city Dionysia major festival in Athens, held every spring. And what did the god think of all this pageantry? But before all this marble and formality, before Aeschylus and Euripides and long poetic monologues, there was just a goat, which leaves one wondering, did the theater evolve because humans needed structure for chaos, or because gods needed an audience for their solitude? You wake again, not with a jolt, but with a gentle sense of movement, like being nudged forward in a slow procession. The clatter of sandals against packed earth, the fluttering of fabric in the wind. And somewhere in the background, the low drone of a distant flute. You are in Athens now, perhaps in the 5th century BC. These playwrights were funded by wealthy citizens choragoi, who paid for the chorus, musicians, costumes, and sets. In return, they hoped for prestige, the same way modern patrons hope for awards or favorable mentions in marble inscriptions. This festival, also known as the City Dionysia, is as much about politics as it is about poetry. And the sleepy undercurrent that runs beneath all of it is this: that a city defined by democracy, by oratory, by deliberation, has chosen to celebrate its patron god of wine and madness through highly organized, deeply repetitive theatrical contests. To truly understand how this came about, one must look at Athens itself. One might see olive branches swaying in the crowd, or phallic symbols held aloft, laughing boys chasing after dancers. The city suspended most business. Prisoners were temporarily released if they could attend. Theater wasn't just entertainment, it was a civic duty. Think of it as jury duty. If jury duty involved choruses in goatskins and a lot of chorus line stomping. And yet, somehow, it had the foresight to turn a wild cult centered around intoxication, into the foundation of public art each year. The Great Dionysia was announced with fanfare. Citizens from the rural areas would pour into the city. The festival lasted several days. On the first day, the sacred statue of Dionysus was paraded through the city and housed in a temporary shrine. The audience sat in the theatronal, large, semicircular space carved into the side of the Acropolis. The earliest versions were made of wooden planks. You might imagine being there, the sun overhead, the salt breeze drifting in from the harbor, and on stage, a masked actor slowly pacing across the platform, declaiming lines written in dactylic hexameter, made of linen or cork, painted with exaggerated expressions. They projected emotion outward. Some say the god watched from his empty marble seat in the front row. Others said he was in the wine jugs passed around during intermissions, or in the sudden breeze that seemed to change a line's meaning. Aeschylus's, Orestia, Sophocles's, Oedipus, Euripus's, Medea were not intended for reruns. The winning playwright received a Rethelive or Ivy, depending on the season and immortal glory, though sometimes only posthumously. Perhaps he admired the irony that the most organized event in Athens celebrated the least predictable god. Or perhaps he simply enjoyed the music. The Choragos, too, was honored. His name would be inscribed on stone, his expenses less so. There were no DVDs, no scripts mailed to foreign theaters. You saw it once, and then it vanished, like wine spilled into the sand. Theaters grew larger, masks became more elaborate, and Dionysus, called Bacchus in Latin, became more associated with drunkenness than drama. But in the shadow of the Acropolis, the original spirit remained. The idea that a city could think about itself by watching actors pretend to be its myths. The mouth was often slightly agape, creating a kind of built-in megaphone. You didn't go to the theater to see someone's face. You went to feel the shape of a myth through sound, movement, and poetic cadence. It sounds like something that would make you yawn, and that's the point. Greek tragedy wasn't about twists or action. It was about inevitability. It was about watching a story you already knew, performed again with a different emphasis, a new shade of grief, or a slightly improved mask. These masks, by the way, were essential. They weren't just to hide the actor's face, they were tools of amplification. And Dionysus, his presence loomed everywhere. A large altar sat in the middle of the performance space. Sacrifices had been made there before the plays began. But not everyone loved the performances. There were those who found them indulgent or tiresome. Philosophers like Plato were skeptical, arguing that theater stirred the emotions too much and distracted citizens from rational thought. Still, the plays continued. And their themes, fate, honor, suffering, divine will, were not just poetic, they were political. When Athens was at war, the plays reflected the unease. When democracy faltered, the dialogue on stage seemed more urgent. It's easy to forget that in this setting, so seemingly grand and mythic, most of the plays we now revere were performed only once. And then came the prizes. On the final day, a vote was held. Each tribe in Athens cast its lot. What did this all mean to Dionysus, a god who loved disorder? In later centuries, Rome would adopt the plays, though more as spectacle than ritual. And the goat, always there, in some form, in the choruses, in the songs, in the prize, watching. Still, a question remains. Was theater born from the chaos Dionysus cherished, or did it tame him just a little with the steady rhythm of performance? As you settle deeper into your seat in the dusty marble theatron, whether imagined or remembered, you begin to notice something peculiar. The stage is quiet, the actors are frozen, but the idea lingers, unbroken. It hangs in the still air, like a wisp of frankincense, or the final hum of a chorus's last note. By the end of the 4th century BCE, much had changed. War with Sparta, Macedonian conquest, the shifting tides of democratic power. And yet the theater, that humble and sacred extension of Dionysian ritual, endured. Theater has stopped, yet it continues. Even after the last goat was awarded, the last wine cup drained, the story stayed. Dionysus, ever the god of boundary crossing, now blurred another line, the one between sacred and secular. He'd planted his vine at the root of civic life, and from it grew an entire tradition of public reflection through performance. The Romans adored spectacle. They repurposed much of what the Greeks had invented, but wrapped it in more pageantry and polish. Masks became more decorative. Amphitheaters grew to seat tens of thousands. Plays leaned into physical comedy and morality tales. Dionysus was renamed Bacchus and largely folded into the broader cults of wine, celebration, and sensuality. Aristophanes, whose biting and absurd plays satirized everything from philosophers to politicians to fellow playwrights, brought a different kind of energy to the stage. His festival was simply accommodating a broader audience, and perhaps a more cynical one. The great Dionysia adapted, just as the god had always done. Laughter now joined weeping as an officially sanctioned form of catharsis. No longer just mythic lamentations. The theater had room for fart jokes, parodied gods, and long-winded monologues about sausage vendors. That's the odd legacy of Dionysus, not just the performances in his honor, but the way his influence trickled down into every corner of staged storytelling thereafter. He never asked for ownership. He just wanted people to show up, wear a mask, and feel something together. But before we wander into the Renaissance and beyond, it's worth pausing again in Athens, this time during the twilight of its classical glory. During this period, the popularity of comedy rose sharply. It was all still in honor of Dionysus, mind you. Meanwhile, the rituals continued, the processions, the songs, the sacrificed animals, and then things moved west. With the rise of the Roman Republic, and later the Empire, Greek theater was absorbed into Latin culture. Still, something of the original intention remained, albeit buried under marble and Latin declension. The structure of the plays, the idea of public storytelling in a shared space, the echo of the chorus they all endured. Even the word tragedy kept its original root, carrying the phantom of that old goat song into languages and cultures far removed from Attica. Centuries passed. The Middle Ages had little time for such rituals. The Church, ever wary of pagan origins, frowned upon theater as a remnant of idolatry. But theater, like Dionysus himself, didn't go away. It simply put on another mask. In England, Shakespeare's Globe echoed the architecture of ancient theaters. Audiences, once again gathered in spring, stood in the open air, drank and gossiped, and sometimes heckled. The stories were new, the language different, but the structure, eerily familiar. Perhaps Dionysus understood something essential about us, that we need containers for our chaos, that by repeating a tragedy, we somehow survive it. Cinema, even reality television, they all descend from that first masked performer standing before a sunburned crowd, chanting a story everyone already knew. Dionysus didn't invent narrative, because performance, at its core, is an offering not just to gods or kings, but to each other. A reminder that for all our absurdity, our fears, our repeated mistakes, we are still capable of watching a play and being moved. But he gave it wine, masked, of course, and waiting for his cue. He gave it rhythm, and, perhaps most importantly, he gave it space. That by laughing at a goat in a mask, space to mourn a fictional hero so you don't collapse over a real one, we come to understand ourselves. In the monasteries and towns, biblical plays began to emerge, morality dramas staged in courtyards and cathedrals, saints and sinners declaiming virtues and temptations with the same melodious repetition as the old tragedies. By the time of the Renaissance, theater had fully re-emerged. This time in forms Dionysus might have found oddly familiar, though perhaps a touch too organized. A tragic hero, a fatal flaw, the themes of transformation, mistaken identity, and theatricality itself, these were his domain. To that first moment reel, or imagined when someone in a mask stepped onto a crude wooden stage and became something else, a king, a god, a fool. In A Midsummer Night's Dream, revelry and confusion unfold in moonlit forests. In the Bacchae, Dionysus himself plays both director and actor, luring mortals into his myth with wine, madness, and performance, a moment of realization and a fall. You could draw a straight line from Sophocles to Shakespeare if you were patient enough and had a few spare goats. Even in Shakespeare's time, echoes of Dionysian ritual remained, though few recognized them. But let's return to Greece, where we started. What does it mean that humans created such spaces? Why build temporary worlds just to dissolve them by sunset? Modern theater, space for you to feel things you can't in your daily life. Space to reflect, together, in the presence of others. And perhaps that's why the god needed an audience, even if it started with a goat. So if tonight you hear the rustle of grapevines, or feel a strange tug toward poetry, dance, or song, perhaps Dionysus is still nearby. But one last thought to linger with you. Was theater Dionysus's gift to mortals? Or was it mortals' gift to Dionysus? You find yourself on a dusty path again, though this one is steeper, winding its way up the rocky slopes of Mount Parnassus in central Greece. The air is thinner here. Cypress trees lean slightly in the mountain breeze. A faint scent of laurel and sulfur hovers in the air. There are pilgrims all around Usum wearing fine robes, others little more than dust-caked tunics. Everyone has questions, and they traveled from distant corners of the Greek world to ask just one person, a woman known only as the Pythia. You're at Delphi, home of the most famous oracle in the ancient world. Pilgrims lined up early. Think of it as a bureaucratic queue with incense instead of ticket numbers. You were expected to ask something clear, focused, and yes, properly phrased in poetic hexameter. This was the Adyton, a dark, subterranean chamber under the temple's main floor. There, the Pythia sat upon a tripod stool, a bronze or wooden three-legged seat placed above a fissure in the rock. That's right, too often had to present your crisis in verse. Some say the gases were hallucinogenic, like ethylene. Others say it's all metaphor. But either way, the effect was powerful. The Pythia entered a trance, sometimes violently, sometimes calmly. Her voice might rise in pitch, she might shake, she might babble, or she might simply speak in slow riddles that no one could quite decipher. Kings, tyrants, and generals all stood before the same tripod, hoping to hear what they wanted to hear, or at least something vague enough to interpret favorably. Entire treasuries were built along the sacred path to the temple, each funded by a different polis. The role, not the person, was sacred. Her words were Apollo's, not her own. She was not a prophet in the modern sense, but a vessel. And while we remember the sanctuary, the stones, the inscriptions, we do not remember her name. Gold, ivory, fine statues, tripods, and bronze offerings filled the sanctuary grounds. Early on, Delphi seemed to champion moderation. The famous maxims carved into the temple entrance, "Know thyself," nothing in excess emphasized balance. When Emperor Julian the Apostate, one of the last pagan emperors, asked the oracle about reviving Hellenism in the 4th century CE, the Pythia's response was eerily final. But later, especially under Roman influence, the oracle was used more for reassurance than guidance. Some cities sent so much treasure they built miniature temples just to house it. A little nerve-wracking, perhaps, especially with your cousin's army waiting just outside Thebes. Before approaching the Pythia, each visitor had to perform a sacrifice at the temple's altar. Goats were preferred. If the goat shivered when sprinkled with cold water, indicating it accepted its fate, it was slaughtered, and only then could you proceed with your question. Delphi, in the ancient Greek imagination, was considered the navel of the world, literally the amphilis, marked by a sacred stone, said to be the center of the earth, not as a mystic, but as a cog in a remarkably well-oiled religious machine. Apollo, god of prophecy, music, logic, and the occasional ill-advised romantic pursuit, had claimed this site after slaying the serpent Python, who had guarded it for centuries. Instead, temple priests listened, transcribed, and interpreted what she said often, rearranging it into refined, poetic responses. You might ask whether to attack Sparta on the new moon, and the response you received could be something like, "To commemorate this triumph, Apollo established his sanctuary here and left a single priestess in charge of dispensing divine wisdom, the Pythia. And because of this, Delphi developed not only spiritual importance, but political weight." You didn't wake up one day and think, I'd like to mumble cryptic truths while high on volcanic gases. No, it was a sacred appointment. The woman had to be of good standing, often older, often celibate or widowed. At first, only women from Delphi could qualify. Later, as the oracle's fame spread, other Greek cities sometimes sent their own priestesses in hopes of influencing the god's whispers. Now, if you're imagining some sort of ethereal, draped in white, crystal ball-gazing seeress, you may want to adjust your expectations slightly. The reality was far more structured, and though it may ruin the mystery, for a moment surprisingly bureaucratic, becoming the Pythia wasn't something you just decided to do on a whim. When the oracle was active in only certain days of the year, mainly during Apollo's sacred months, you could expect quite a scene. And what a question it had to be. You didn't get to ramble or pour your heart out. Once your offering had been accepted and your question passed inspection by the temple staff, who included priests, treasurers, record keepers, and something akin to early PR agents, you were ushered into the inner sanctum of the temple of Apollo. From this fissure, according to some ancient accounts, rose mysterious vapors, possibly from subterranean gases. Modern scholars argue over this. But she didn't do this alone. That's where the bureaucracy returned. The Pythias utterances were not delivered directly to the pilgrim. When the black ram dances with the sun, victory shall come, but only to the ones who wait. What did that mean? Nobody knew. Probably don't attack, or maybe do, but not on a Thursday. Interpretation was half the game. City-states consulted the oracle before founding colonies, waging war, drafting laws, or entering treaties. Delphi grew wealthy absurdly so. Each city that came left behind treasures in exchange for prophecies. And yet, behind the grandeur, the Pythia herself remained anonymous. As the centuries passed, the nature of the oracle's advice shifted. By the time the Roman Emperor Nero visited in the 1st century CE and reportedly stole 500 statues, the site was already in decline. Tell the king the splendid hall has fallen to ruin. Apollo no longer has a shelter, nor laurel leaves, nor speaking spring. And just like that, the voice of Apollo went silent. But before the silence before the stones crumbled and the laurel dried, there were centuries where a single woman sat above a crack in the earth, day after sacred day, answering impossible questions with impossible riddles. Which brings us to a question worth pondering in the hush of this moment. Was the oracle's power truly diviner? Did it lie in the careful structure, the human interpretation, and the shared belief that questions deserved more mystery than answers? You return once more to Delphi, but now the mood has shifted. The sun has risen higher on Mount Parnassus. The scent of bay leaves and burnt offerings is more pronounced, and the sanctuary is bustling, not with solemn pilgrims, but with the unmistakable din of administration. Because while you may think of oracles as the province of spiritual murmurs and divine ecstasy, the reality especially at Delphi was much more clerical. The oracle's power didn't simply radiate from volcanic fumes or inspired trances. It had to be supported, processed, interpreted, and recorded. In other words, Apollo's divine messages ran through what might best be described as an ancient Greek office. Let us begin at the entrance to the sacred precinct known as the Temenos. Visitors from Corinth, Thebes, Ephesus, or even as far as Carthage or Libya would have to check in, metaphorically speaking. Behind the scenes, temple secretaries recorded responses in official registers, sometimes on papyrus scrolls, other times chiseled into stone if the message was deemed especially significant. There was a protocol. You didn't just arrive, wave a goat at the altar, and get ushered into the presence of the Pythia. Which cities renewed their vows? What civic project did Sparta ask about this time? And the paperwork, though not made of paper, strictly speaking, was just as voluminous as any modern bureaucracy. Apollo's temple at Delphi employed dozens of personnel, most of them highly educated and politically savvy. Wealthier Peleus built entire treasuries, small temple-like structures lining the sacred wache containing their dedications. The Athenian treasury gleamed with Parian marble. The Siphnian treasury boasted carved friezes of mythological battles. These weren't just offerings, they were advertisements, a visual, architectural reminder of who supported Apollo best. The Propheti, not to be confused with the Pythia, were male priests who functioned as interpreters and handlers of divine communications. Think of them as the legal advisors or translators. These were logged and displayed, and they carried political implications. If Corinth donated a silver chariot and received a favorable prophecy, while Thebes only left a pair of polished shields, well, you could imagine the murmurs around the olive oil amphory when the Pythia mumbled something about a black bird in a silver tree. It was the prophetai who shaped it into verse or public policy. First, you needed authorization, a right granted only to certain citizens or states with promantio priority access. Promantia was a sort of fast pass issued by the temple, often as a political gift. Some cities earned it through alliances or generous donations. For others, it was hereditary. For everyone else, waiting in line was a near sacred act. These waiting periods could stretch days or even weeks, depending on how many inquiries had backed up in the temple's queue, and who managed this queue. A full staff of priests, scribes, treasurers, assistants, and custodians. Then came the hozoi, sacred officials, who oversaw rituals and ensured everything adhered to religious law. Imagine the records room, bundles of scrolls tied with string, sealed in beeswax, some stacked on wooden shelves beside inventories of offerings. How many tripods from Argos this season? Delphia's oracle was not a solitary figure in a transit, was the centerpiece of a remarkably complex network of spiritual messaging and international diplomacy. Cities treated their interactions with Delphi like foreign policy. Ambassadors arrived bearing pomper ritual gifts, softened gold or rare vessels, sometimes elaborate dedications. This competitive gift-giving led to a sort of arms race of religious sponsorship. Meanwhile, the Pythia continued her work. Her role was bound to the rhythms of Apollo's seasonal power. In myth, Apollo spent part of the year away in Hyperborea, a mythical land of perpetual sunshine and quiet. During these months, roughly winter, Delphi's oracle went silent. But even in his absence, the temple operated. There were repairs to supervise, finances to track, festivals to organize. In an age without centralized currency, without printing presses or postal systems, Delphi managed a multi-century operation that spanned continents. Sacred envoys, called theoroi, were dispatched to announce major events. Offerings were catalogued and stored with ceremonial care. And through it all, the Pythia, whether inspired or exhausted, answered questions at the heart of empire building. The Pythia's responses were still issued, but now her words were filtered through Latin translators and Roman politics. Eventually, the temple found itself in the curious position of being funded and protected by a distant empire, while still clinging to its Greek traditions. More and more, her answers were conservative, vague, and aimed at preserving the temple's status rather than revealing divine insight. The system had become so polished, so procedural, that even gods might have found it a little predictable. Ah, yes, the festivals. Chief among them was the Pythian Games, second only to the Olympics in prestige. But by who filled out the right form, sealed the correct amphora, or drafted the most pleasing verse on bronze? Behind every poetic prophecy, there was a temple clerk with a wax tablet. They emerged through scrolls, schedules, rosters, and processions. Divinity was not the opposite of order, but its highest expression. Held every 4 years, they combined athletic and artistic competitions in honor of Apollo. Poets, musicians, and athletes competed for laurel wreaths. The stadium sat thousands. By the classical period, various Greek city-states vied for influence over the sanctuary. The Amphictyonic League, a kind of intercity council, governed Delphi's religious matters, but its members weren't always neutral. When tensions rose, say, between Athens and Sparta, their disputes often played out at Delphi in rituals, dedications, and oracular interpretation. The theater, yes, Delphi had two hosted choral performances that echoed across the rocky cliffs. The oracle's neutral reputation was compromised as rival factions tried to sway prophecies in their favor. In one case, an oracle was accused of being bribed. Whether true or not, the very idea shows how intertwined the divine and the administrative had become. Even these events were carefully documented and administered by temple officials. Gold wreaths had to be weighed, wine rations tallied, crowd control managed. It's worth pausing to reflect on just how extraordinary this was. But Delphi's bureaucratic excellence came with a risk. It was deeply entangled with politics. One such example was during the Sacred Wars, a series of conflicts over control of the temple itself. Even Rome got involved. By the 2nd century BCE, Roman generals began consulting the oracle not always sincerely, but for public effect. And as the bureaucracy expanded, the mystery diminished. The Pythias role was increasingly ceremonial, but perhaps that's the point. In Delphi, the gods weren't expected to appear in thunderclaps or burning bushes. And when you think about it, that's oddly comforting. For all the grandeur of myth, sometimes history is shaped not by lightning bolts, which raises a question that may keep you company as you drift further into this story's silence. Was Delphi a place where gods spoke to mortals, or a place where mortals learned how to speak like gods? You return one last time to Delphi, but now the paths are quieter. The temple stones are worn, and the ivy creeps farther up the columns than before. The crowds have thinned. The sound of foreign tongues still drifts through the air, but they are no longer Doric, Ionic, or Aeolic. They're Latin, and they speak not of omens and offerings, but of trade routes and taxation. The oracle still speaks, but more softly now. It is the 1st century CE. Rome rules the Mediterranean. They want prophecies with deadlines, oracles that reassure their divine right to govern. The oracle is no longer the cryptic conscience of Grisette, has become part of the ceremonial furniture of empire. The Delphic oracle, once the heartbeat of the Greek spiritual world, now answers to senators and Caesars. But later, Emperor Hadrian, that gentle student of Greek culture, restores the sanctuary, rebuilds structures, and rededicates the temple to its former glory. For a little while, the old rhythms return: the sacrifice, the cues, the murmured verses. The pilgrim path is still walked, but more often for curiosity than conviction. And the woman on the tripod, she remains, her voice steady, though her listeners increasingly treat her like a curiosity and exotic remnant of a poetic past. Still, there are moments. The Emperor Nero visits and removes hundreds of statues from the site, souvenirs, perhaps, or a statement. But you can feel the shift, even from the sacred stones. Like many ancient institutions, Delphi didn't collapse, simply dissolved. The rise of Christianity under Constantine and his successors saw pagan temples repurposed, closed, or left to decay. Pilgrimages ceased. The theater, the stadium, the temple foundations all rose again in sunlight. She was the most important woman in the ancient Greek world for nearly 1,000 years, and she remains nameless. The last known Pythia likely sat in a half-crumbled temple, whispering answers no one came to hear. And imagine her sitting cross-legged on a tripod, half-entranced, half-tired, offering riddles to strangers. Her job was not to change the world, but to question it, to turn every yes into a perhaps, and every no into a story. The Roman worldview, practical and imperial, leaves little room for ambiguity. Earthquakes rattled the mountainside. The temple stones tumbled and cracked. Eventually, the site was buried under soil, forgotten. Not that gods vanished, but that they changed addresses. The need to ask impossible questions remains. The need for structure, too. A medieval village called Castri grew over the ruins. It wasn't until the 19th century, when French archaeologists began digging beneath its streets, that Delphi was rediscovered. The echo of questions, the flicker of incense, a gentle voice saying, "And yet, the Pythia still sits, still breathes in the scent of laurel and the occasional inexplicable gas from below the earth. She still answers. In 362 CE, a final flicker. But the idea behind it remains, that even the gods, in all their glory, must speak through structure, through process, through people. The Emperor Julian often called the apostate because he rejected Christianity and tried to revive pagan religion rites to Delphi, desperate to rekindle the old faith. The temples are empty, the sacrifices have dwindled. He wants the gods to speak again. The oracle's reply is melancholy, almost theatrical. Tell the king the fair-wrought hall has fallen. Apollo has no longer his house, nor the prophesying laurel, nor the speaking well. The voice of the water is silent. With those words, the oracle faded into history. It wasn't a sudden end. Over time, nature reclaimed what marble left behind. They found fragments, inscriptions in careful lettering, sculpted lions, half-broken columns, coins from dozens of cities. Treasuries, long looted, were reconstructed stone by stone. But they did not find the Pythia. She left no tomb, no statue, no identifying mark, and yet her presence lingers. You can still stand in the temple's remains today, feel the wind whistle through broken columns, and if you listen closely, not with ears, but with that quiet, sleepy part of your mind, you might still hear it. You already know the answer. You just wanted to ask. The bureaucratic miracle of Delphiate's temple registers, its rosters, its queues and inventory lists, is long gone. In the end, perhaps that's the lesson. Not that prophecy died, but that it became quieter. So as you drift now into whatever landscape your dreams offer, one final question hovers. Did the oracle vanish because we stopped believing in her, or because, over time, we became the ones answering our own riddles? You awaken this time in a city not yet fully formed. The marble is rough, the streets are dusty, and the names of its citizens have not yet echoed across history. It is a place of promise, perched between sea and mountain, a cluster of homes, goats, and half-formed temples under an open attic sky. This place will one day be called Athens. But before that, it is simply the city, Palisa, community, with great ambition and, as you'll soon learn, one very difficult decision to make. The story is older than parchment, older than coin or calendar. It's said that the gods of Olympus looked down one day and took a sudden interest in this humble settlement on the rocky coast. Perhaps they admired its location, or perhaps they were just bored. The one who gave the more useful offering would win the devotion of the city and its name. It would become their sanctuary, their shrine, their symbol. Either way, two gods in particular laid claim to it: Poseidon, lord of the sea, and Athena, goddess of wisdom, strategy, and calm counsel. He struck the earth with his trident, and from the spot a spring burst forth, or in some versions, a mighty horse leaped from the ground. The city took her name, Athens. Her statue would one day stand atop the Acropolis, gazing out not just over the city, but over a promise that war may be necessary, but peace and patience could build something greater. The gift was meant to impress, a symbol of naval power, speed, and conquest, sea trade, warfare, expansion. And so, in a moment of divine formality, a contest was proposed. She emerged clad in armor, spear in hand, eyes bright with wisdom. She was her father's mind made manifest. She was thought before action. The gods would each offer a gift to the people. That role belonged to Ares, god of raw aggression, unreasoned fury, the kind of battle that ends in chaos. Athena's domain was cooler. She represented tactical thinking, restraint, and foresight. She advised generals. She granted clarity. She fought, but only when the plan was sound. Poseidon, never one for subtlety, stepped forward first. But the spring, while dramatic, gushed salt water, and the horse, magnificent as it was, brought with it the hint of future wars. Then it was Athena's turn. She stepped forward calmly. No thunder, no splashes. Its wood could build homes, ships, tools. Its presence hinted at permanence. It did not demand conquest. It invited cultivation. She pressed her spear into the soil, and from that spot grew an olive tree. Its trunk was crooked, its leaves silvery. The fruit it bore was modest, no divine lightning, no armies in its roots, but the people saw something deeper. The olive tree promised sustenance soil to eat, to light lamps, to soften leather, to anoint the body. And so the citizens, in their early wisdom, chose Athena. But what's most curious is that Athena, goddess of war strategy, patron of heroes, weaver of battle plans, chose a tree instead of a weapon. Why? To answer that, you need to step back and understand Athena herself. She was not a goddess of brute force. Her birth says as much. According to myth, she sprang fully formed from Zeus's head, no infancy, no awkward adolescence. And the olive tree, it fit her perfectly. Because cultivating olives takes patience, years, even decades, before the trees produce a meaningful yield. They require dry climates, rocky soils, and regular tending. Their fruit must be soaked, cured, pressed. Nothing about olives is immediate, but once established, the trees live for centuries, some for over 1,000 years. Generations may pass under their shade. To choose an olive tree was to choose longevity over spectacle, resilience over speed, quiet abundance over loud conquest. It was philosophical. You can almost imagine her watching the contest unfold, calm as ever, while Poseidon thundered beside her. He offered dominance, she offered survival, and she won. The tree she planted was said to grow on the Acropolis itself, beside the Parthenon. Even after the Persians sacked the city in 480 BCE, even after the fire had burned and statues lay shattered, the olive tree reportedly sprouted again, new green leaves pushing up from blackened roots. A reminder that resilience is its own kind of power. Later, the city of Athens would protect its olive trees by law. Destroying one was a criminal offense. Special state officials were appointed to tend and monitor them. The trees were tied to land ownership, to economy, to ritual. Olives were everywhere, in tombs, in temples, in court records, and behind them, always, stood the quiet figure of Athena. Her temple, the Parthenon, was adorned not just with battle scenes and divine epics, but also with panels showing olive harvesting and civic life. The goddess was not above practical concerns. She ruled not from the clouds, but from the city's stone heart, where markets buzzed, and juries deliberated, and amphorae of olive oil lined the docks at Piraeus. There's something oddly soothing about that image, the goddess of war, not sharpening a sword, but watching over orchards. Her symbol not a spear, but a tree that bends in the wind and endures. But it raises a curious question. Why did a city that would go on to build an empire, conquer distant shores, and celebrate military victories choose to define itself with a tree rather than a weapon? Was it because it hoped deep down that its greatness would come not from war, but from wisdom? The olive tree has now been chosen. The contest on the hill is long over. But while Athena's symbolic tree still rustles on the Acropolis, down in the streets below it has multiplied. Amphorae filled with olive oil lined storerooms and markets, and in the cool, dim corners of the Athenian agora, the olive has taken on a second life as paperwork. Yes, for all its spiritual significance, the olive became something far more pedestrian, a line item, a tax category, a bureaucratic cornerstone of the Athenian economy. Let's start with the most basic point. Olive oil was everywhere. Athenians used it for lighting lamps, cooking, cosmetics, medicinal salves, and even as a base for perfumes. Wrestlers in the gymnasium would coat themselves in it before training. Infants were anointed with it. Corpses were bathed in it before burial. An Athenian without olive oil was, well, not really Athenian. Because of this, the state took it very seriously. Attica's sacred olive trees, known as Moriae, were considered public property, even when they grew on private land. You could cultivate them, you could harvest their fruit, but you could not destroy them. The penalty for cutting down a Moria was severe fines, exile, even execution in extreme cases. These trees were sacred, not just in name, but in law. Trees and ensure they were healthy, upright, and undisturbed. Their records were detailed, their inspections regular. In this, the olive became more than a crop. It became a managed asset, and its fruits were often weighed, taxed, and stored in state-controlled granaries. And the oil, it had its own amphorae, Panathenaic amphorae, to be precise. These were large ceramic vessels, awarded as prizes during the Panathenaic Games, a festival held in honor of Athena every 4 years. The amphorae were painted in a strict style, Athena on one side, the athletic contest on the other. Each was filled with olive oil from the sacred groves, and champions might take home dozens of them. The oil was valuable, sometimes more valuable than the prize money itself. Winning a foot race or wrestling match might bring you fame. Winning olive oil could make you rich. And yet, amid all this abundance, there was quiet order. The Athenians were obsessed with records. Decrees about olive oil appear on stone steles, inscribed in Stoic Doric capitals. Contracts mention quantities. Ode. Inventories list amphorae, volume, and source. There was something peculiarly Athenian about this, elevating a sacred gift into a civic system, turning a divine symbol into an economic engine. Athena's wisdom was never just philosophical. It was practical, measured, balanced, and the olive followed suit. Even in religion, it appeared. The goddess was often depicted with an olive wreath, not a helmet. At sacrifices, oil was poured over altars. New citizens were anointed with it. Olive branches racioni were hung at doors during festivals. In temples, priests tended eternal olive oil lamps that flickered quietly day and night, like memory itself. The olive's influence stretched into law courts, to Athens, famed for its democracy, had courts packed with citizen jurors, drawn by lot. The stipends paid to jurors were sometimes funded by oil taxes. State revenues depended, in part, on the success of the harvest. A bad olive season could ripple through the machinery of law and politics. And here, perhaps, is the strangest thing. A goddess of war had quietly constructed a city powered not by conquest, but by cultivation. Not by iron, but by oil. Even Athens' ships, those famous triremes that fanned out across the Aegean, were oiled with olive to protect their hulls. The tree's utility reached even into war, but never through violence. Always through support. As you walk through an Athenian market now, you'll see this clearly. Olives sold in woven baskets, oil poured into smaller flasks, vendors squatting behind crates, haggling in clipped phrases. The scent is everywhere, earthy, warm, persistent. Children carry jugs home. Women rub it into skin under shaded colonnades. Priests carry it in golden bowls up to the Acropolis. And if you tilt your head just right, you can almost imagine Athena watching, not with the intensity of a general, but with the calm focus of an accountant reviewing balance sheets, approving, guiding, keeping her city orderly, because this, too, is wisdom. And perhaps that's why she chose the olive tree, not for its symbolism, but for its systems, its long-term logic, its ability to bind divine mystery and mundane necessity into one trunk, one branch, one silvery leaf. But that raises a softer question, one not etched in any decree. Did Athena know the olive tree would outlast her temples, her festivals, even her name? The olive tree has now been chosen. The contest on the hill is long over, and the dusty polis that once huddled below has become a bustling city, Athens, gleaming under its Attic sun. But while Athena's symbolic tree still rustles on the Acropolis, down in the streets below, it has multiplied. Orchards spread across the region, amphorae filled with olive oil line storerooms and markets. And in the cool, dim corners of the Athenian agora, the olive has taken on a second life as paperwork. Yes, for all its spiritual significance, the olive became something far more pedestrian, a line item, a tax category, a bureaucratic cornerstone of the Athenian economy. Let's start with the most basic point. Olive oil was everywhere. Athenians used it for lighting lamps, cooking, cosmetics, medicinal salves, and even as a base for perfumes. Wrestlers in the gymnasium would coat themselves in it before training. Infants were anointed with it. Corpses were bathed in it before burial. An Athenian without olive oil was, well, not really Athenian. Because of this, the state took it very seriously. Attica's sacred olive trees, known as Moriae, were considered public property even when they grew on private land. You could cultivate them, you could harvest their fruit, but you could not destroy them. The penalty for cutting down a Moria was severe fines, exile, even execution in extreme cases. These trees were sacred not just in name but in law. They were directly tied to the protection of Athena to manage this leafy infrastructure. Athens appointed inspectors, officials called nomon's, whose job was to examine the sacred olive trees and ensure they were healthy, upright, and undisturbed. Their records were detailed, their inspections regular. In this, the olive became more than a crop. It became a managed asset, and its fruits were often weighed, taxed, and stored in state-controlled granaries. And the oil. It had its own amphorae, Panathenaic amphorae, to be precise. These were large ceramic vessels awarded as prizes during the Panathenaic Games, a festival held in honor of Athena every 4 years. The amphorae were painted in a strict style, Athena on one side, the athletic contest on the other. Each was filled with olive oil from the sacred groves, and champions might take home dozens of them. The oil was valuable, sometimes more valuable than the prize money itself. Winning a foot race or wrestling match might bring you fame. Winning olive oil could make you rich, and yet, amid all this abundance, there was quiet order. The Athenians were obsessed with records. Decrees about olive oil appear on stone steles inscribed in Stoic Doric capitals. Contracts mention quantities. Ode. Inventories list amphorae, volume, and source. There was something peculiarly Athenian about this, elevating a sacred gift into a civic system, turning a divine symbol into an economic engine. Athena's wisdom was never just philosophical. It was practical, measured, balanced, and the olives followed suit. Even in religion, it appeared. The goddess was often depicted with an olive wreath, not a helmet. At sacrifices, oil was poured over altars. New citizens were anointed with it. Olive branches Aricioni were hung at doors during festivals. In temples, priests tended eternal olive oil lamps that flickered quietly day and night. Like memory itself, the olive's influence stretched into law courts to Athens, famed for its democracy, had courts packed with citizen jurors drawn by lot. The stipends paid to jurors were sometimes funded by oil taxes. State revenues depended, in part, on the success of the harvest. A bad olive season could ripple through the machinery of law and politics. And here, perhaps, is the strangest thing. A goddess of war had quietly constructed a city powered not by conquest, but by cultivation, not by iron, but by oil. Even Athens' ships, those famous triremes that fanned out across the Aegean, were oiled with olive to protect their hulls. The tree's utility reached even into war, but never through violence, always through support. As you walk through an Athenian market now, you'll see this clearly. Olives sold in woven baskets, oil poured into smaller flasks, vendors squatting behind crates, haggling in clipped phrases. The scent is everywhere earthy, warm, persistent. Children carry jugs home. Women rub it into skin under shaded colonnades. Priests carry it in golden bowls up to the Acropolis. And if you tilt your head just right, you can almost imagine Athena watching, not with the intensity of a general, but with the calm focus of an accountant reviewing balance sheets, approving, guiding, keeping her city orderly, because this, too, is wisdom. And perhaps that's why she chose the olive tree, not for its symbolism, but for its systems, its long-term logic, its ability to bind divine mystery and mundane necessity into one trunk, one branch, one silvery leaf. But that raises a softer question, one not etched in any decree. Did Athena know the olive tree would outlast her temples, her festivals, even her name? And now the city is quieter again. Centuries have passed. The voices of Pericles and Socrates have faded into dust. The roar of Panathenaic games is silent. Even the steady hands that once inscribed olive laws into stone have long since gone. Still, but high above the city, battered by wind and sun. There stands still the olive tree. It's not the same one, of course. Not exactly. Trees age and crack, burn and regrow. But this one, they say, grows from the roots of the original, the tree Athena gave to Athens on the day she won the city. And in some quiet way, it remembers everything. It remembered the Parthenon when it was new, when the marble glowed white in the afternoon light and phalanxes of sculptors chipped at figures of centaurs and gods. It remembered the festival's saffron-robed girls dancing in procession. Laurel crowns passed from victor to victor, the heavy aroma of roasted lamb and incense rising toward the bright Aegean sky. It remembered the philosophers, thinkers who paced beneath its leaves or wrote scrolls by oil lamp. It remembered Plato's careful metaphors, Aristotle's lists, Zeno's paradoxes, and Hypatia's whispered heresies. And it remembered, too, the first time the city burned. When Xerxes' Persian army reached the Acropolis in 480 BCE, the Athenians had already fled to their ships. Only a few defenders remained, and they were slaughtered. The temples were razed, the statues toppled, the sacred olive tree was torched, and yet, the story goes, the very next day, a green shoot emerged from its blackened roots. The Athenians returned and saw in that shoot a sign not of magic, but of memory. Athena had not abandoned them. Her tree-like, the city would regrow. They rebuilt, and the olive tree remained. When the Romans arrived, they marveled at it. Emperors walked past it. Hadrian, who admired Greece with a scholar's eye, may have rested in its shade. Roman tourists chipped bits of bark for souvenirs, but they left the tree standing. Time passed. The Parthenon changed hands. It became a Christian church dedicated to the Virgin Mary, whom the Byzantines quietly likened to Athena in her calm and wisdom. Icons replaced statues. Olive oil still burned in the lamps. The tree stood, watching, listening. Then came the Ottomans. The Parthenon became a mosque. A minaret rose from its side. The olive tree rustled in unfamiliar prayers. Pilgrims still passed beneath it, some aware of what it meant, others not. And then came 1687. Venetian cannons bombarded Athens. One shell struck the Parthenon, which at the time was being used as an Ottoman gunpowder store. The explosion ripped through marble and memory alike. Statues crumbled, walls shattered. The great temple was broken, but the olive tree, somehow, in some way, it survived. Again, maybe damaged, maybe scorched, but alive. Even in the centuries that followed, as foreign travelers came with sketchbooks and pickaxes, the tree remained. Lord Byron saw it. So did French archaeologists in the 1800s, digging under the Acropolis to unearth forgotten stones. In 1897, a Greek gardener planted a new olive sapling where the sacred one had stood, a replacement or a descendant, or perhaps just a placeholder for something timeless. And that sapling grew today. When you walk the Acropolis, the air still carries the scent of dry grass and sun-warmed stone. Tourists take selfies. Guides recite myths in multiple languages. The Parthenon stands in broken grandeur, wrapped in scaffolding like an elderly queen getting dressed, and beside it, quietly, the olive tree. Its trunk is thick and twisted. Its bark bears scorch marks. Its leaves shimmer in the wind like silver coins. No signs point to it. There's no plaque. But those who know, this is the tree, or its child, or its spirit, or its symbol. And so we return to the beginning, to Athena's choice, to the question of why a goddess of war chose a tree instead of a sword. You see now, don't you? The sword cuts, but the tree outlasts. A sword makes history briefly. A tree holds it. A sword wins battles. A tree feeds generations. And maybe Athena, in her cool, strategic wisdom, saw further than her fellow gods. Maybe she knew that cities do not survive by force alone, but by memory, by ritual, by endurance. And what better symbol for that than an olive tree? It bends, but does not break. It gives, but does not demand. It grows slowly, yet lives for centuries. It watches, and even now, while the gods have grown quiet, and their temples half crumbled, and their names worn smooth by time, the tree is still there, and perhaps, if you sit beneath it and close your eyes, to the noise of the tourists, but to the whisper of the leaves you might hear her voice again, not commanding, not shouting, but simply reminding you, wisdom is patient, power fades, but some roots grow deeper than stone, and then the wind moves on, the leaves settle, and all that remains is the stillness. Imagine, for a moment, walking through an ancient cemetery, not a crumbling stone necropolis full of ghosts and whispers, but a vibrant city for the dead. The sun is shining, the grass is trimmed, frescoes line the walls of underground chambers, and everywhere you look there are smiles. Some are carved into sarcophagi, others painted in red and black on burial urns. But occasionally, in the tombs of this ancient world, archaeologists have found something stranger still, real teeth in real jaws bound together with gold. Bands, you've just stepped into the curious world of the Etruscans, long before the rise of Rome. Central Italy was home to this enigmatic civilization, traders, metalworkers, artists, and engineers who flourished between the 8th and 3rd centuries. BCE, they built cities, worshipped shadowy gods, and left behind some of the most elegant tombs in ancient Europe. But among their many overlooked achievements, one stands out for its quiet brilliance. They may have been the first civilization to practice prosthetic dentistry. Yes, dental work. In gold. Now, it might not seem like the kind of history that moves empires. There are no battlefield charges, no fiery speeches, no thundering oracles. But there's something tender and deeply human in this. The decision to fix a smile, even when no one but the gods might ever see it. The Etruscan dental bridges found in multiple tombs, particularly those of high-status women, were remarkably sophisticated for their time. They involved bands of flat gold wire wrapped around healthy teeth, anchoring false ones in place. Sometimes the replacement teeth were carved from bone or ivory. In other cases, they were human, perhaps donated, or recycled from another mouth. Modern archaeologists call these dental appliances, but they were more than functional. They were ornamental, even elegant. In an era when most ancient people had few options beyond yanking a bad tooth out with a piece of twine, the Etruscans were fitting gold wire bridges into the mouths of their elite. But here's the truly curious part. Many of these devices were found on corpses, not living patients. So what were these dental wonders really for? Some scholars believe they were indeed worn during life, symbols of wealth, status, or even divine favor. A dazzling smile might have been just as important at a banquet as a new cloak or a fragrant vial of imported perfume. but in other cases, especially when the wiring appears freshly installed in a burial context, the gold was likely added after death, which begs a strange and gentle question. Who were these gold smiles for? Themselves, their ancestors, their gods? Maybe, in a culture obsessed with the afterlife, it simply made sense that you should enter the underworld looking your best. The Etruscans believed in a kind of shadowy eternity, a place where the dead lived on in reflection of the living world. Their tombs were often painted with scenes of music, feasting, and games. Perhaps a good dental bridge was just part of the dress code. It's a lovely thought, isn't it? That somewhere beneath layers of volcanic soil and centuries of silence, a noble woman lies at rest, her fingers wrapped in bronze rings, her ears still glinting with amber, and her teeth polished and neatly bridged in gold, still grinning faintly toward the other side. But the Etruscans didn't just bury their dead in finery. Their entire society was woven through with ritual, refinement, and quiet care. Let's pause, then, and look a little closer at who they were. Unlike their Roman successors, the Etruscans embraced a more egalitarian approach to gender. Women could own property, dine at banquets, even appear with their husbands in publica, shocking concept to many later Roman writers. Etruscan tombs show women reclining alongside men on sarcophagi, their names inscribed, their smiles wide, and among those smiles, some have gold behind them. The dental bridges were likely made by skilled metalworkers, perhaps the same craftsmen who shaped earrings and fibulae. No texts survive describing Etruscan dental techniques, no manuals or diagrams, but the work speaks for itself. Steady hands, keen eyes, a sense of proportion and balance. It's not hard to imagine such a craftsman at work, in a small shop beside a sunlit forum, hunched over a wax tablet, measuring a customer's mouth with bone calipers, melting gold over coals, twisting wire into anchors, carving a substitute molar from oxbone, polishing it smooth with a scrap of wool dot, and perhaps, occasionally, preparing a set not for the living, but for the funerary chamber, slipping a final bridge into place before the face was covered and the tomb sealed shut. It was an ongoing journey, and appearance mattered. Of course, like so much of Etruscan culture, the dental bridges leave us with more questions than answers. Why did this tradition disappear? The Romans, who absorbed and erased much of Etruscan identity, never took up the practice. In fact, they often ridiculed Etruscan excess, calling them decadent, effeminate, overly fond of luxuries. Was the practice lost, forbidden, or simply out of fashion? All that remains now are a few hundred scattered tombs, a handful of well-preserved jaws, and the golden traces of a vanished people who looked at death and smiled anyway. And that raises a sleepy, curious thought to carry with you into the night. What might your smile say centuries from now, when no one remembers your name but the shape of your teeth, and the care taken to preserve them still lingers in the earth?